In the Passover narrative, the Lord struck down all the firstborn of Egypt. Was this infanticide? Why did this plague not affect Ramesses II if he was a firstborn son? And why were the cattle affected? Find out on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. In this video, we are going to discuss three common objections that often surround Exodus 12:29 in order to understand this passage at a deeper level. First, let's read the passage. Now, it came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. Now, the first objection to this passage that is often cited is, this passage is about God killing all the firstborn children of the Egyptians. Skeptics love talking about this passage as being an example of how horrible the God of the Bible is, because the passage says that during the Passover, God killed all the firstborn children of the Egyptians. For example, Satan's Guide to the Bible repeatedly says firstborn children to really drive home the point that this is about God killing infants. However, there are some problems with this objection. First, the text does not say children anywhere, but only refers to them as the firstborn. Now, the Western reader will often assume that this means children, but that is an assumption not supported by either the text or the context. In the ancient Near Eastern context, a firstborn is not the first child in ordinal birth. For example, Ishmael is the oldest son of Abraham in ordinal birth, but Isaac is the firstborn. So what is the difference between being first in birth order versus being firstborn? Being the firstborn is the same as being the designated inheritor. It is an election or designation, not a happenstance of physical birth order. This is the son who gets the double portion of the inheritance and all the clan titles and honor associated with the father. We have to understand that ordinal birth plays little role because of the high incidence of infant mortality in the ancient world. Nearly half of all babies born did not survive past their first birthday. So for the term firstborn to make any sense at all, it cannot strictly apply to only those who were the first in order of birth. The way this works is that the one who is designated a firstborn remains a firstborn until either his father dies and he comes into his inheritance, or the father changes who he selects as firstborn, for example, Genesis 48:17-18, or the firstborn dies before his father, and the next eldest son becomes the firstborn. Therefore, it is important to understand that being the firstborn is not a matter of age. One can be regarded as a firstborn even as an old man. Crown Prince Merneptah was in his 60s and 13th in line to the throne, while still being considered the firstborn of King Ramesses II. Now, once the father passes away, the firstborn is no longer the firstborn because he has come into his inheritance. Firstborns are only those who are waiting to receive their inheritances, not those who have already received them. And even though it was judgment for killing of all the Israel male children in Exodus 1:22, The Passover plague was not restricted to children, but instead, the vast majority of those hit by the Passover plague were already adults. Now, a second objection when it comes to this passage is, if Ramesses II was the firstborn of his father, Seti I, why wasn't he affected by the Passover plague? Now, this is an objection often raised by early Exodus proponents. They basically say that not only did the king who came after the Exodus Pharaoh had to not be a firstborn son, but the Exodus Pharaoh himself could not have been a firstborn. Otherwise, he would have been killed by the Passover plague also. I've heard guys like Douglas Petrovich raise this objection in support of Amenhotep II as Pharaoh of the Exodus, stating that Amenhotep II was not the firstborn of Tutmosis III. And since Ramesses II was a firstborn, the king of the Exodus could not have been Ramesses II because he would have also been killed by the Passover plague. Now, there are two reasons why this objection fails. The first is a cultural reason. As mentioned already, as soon as a firstborn receives an inheritance, he is simply no longer a firstborn. He is the owner of all that he was designated to receive. So no king at the time he is ruling could be a firstborn, because he received all that he would inherit from his predecessor. He is no longer firstborn, but king. The second is a biblical reason. The text itself is self-limiting. The Passover plague has limits built into the text. Quote, "From the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle." End quote. Pharaoh is specifically excluded from being among those stricken by the Passover plague. Whether that is because he was excluded because of the cultural reason mentioned previously, or because God made an exception for him, we are not told explicitly by the text. However, the text all by itself states that Pharaoh was excluded. So Ramesses II, even as the firstborn of his father Seti I, would not have been affected by the Passover plague, because the text of the passage excludes Pharaoh himself. Now, a third and final objection rising out of this passage is, how were the firstborn of the cattle affected by the Passover plague, since they do not inherit and have no privileges in the same way that human firstborn children do? Okay, we should mention that the animals denoted in these texts are domesticated animals, such as cattle, sheep, and horses. So then we can apply the question, what kind of inheritance would apply to domesticated animals? The fact is that there is a kind of designated inheritance that applies to domesticated animals. That is, as breeding stock. The best animals are selected out and designated for breeding purposes to pass on the best genes to the next generation of animals. So there is a kind of firstborn that applies to domesticated animals, just as there are designated inheritors among human families. So anyway, we have touched on 3 separate objections that deal with Exodus 12:29. We hope you learned something about the interpretation and cultural context of this passage, and we will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.